The Love, Life, and Lose Weight podcast will teach you the art and science of changing your habits around food. If you know what to do, but can't figure out why you're just not doing it, this is the right podcast for you. I'm your host, Advanced Certified Weight and Life Coach, Heather Beardsley. I've helped hundreds of women just like you figure out how to think and eat like a normal eater, lose weight, and love life on the journey to goal weight and beyond. Hi, welcome to a bonus episode where I'm going to answer some questions that were some of my email followers have sent in to me ahead of time. So this won't be a live conversation, but just one in which I kind of just coached to the question, and I'm kind of going to read them in real time. I haven't rehearsed any of these answers. So let's see what we have. The first one is from, let's see, Allison. She says, if I had a question, I'm not really sure what it would be, as things in my life are running smoothly for the most part. However, I've recently lost 40 pounds over 15 months with the help of Wegovy. I guess I could be curious about what happens when the meds go away. How does a person deal with the brain chatter they've had for 30 plus years when the meds are gone? My strategy and thinking currently is that I want to stay on a low maintenance dose when the time comes. Allison. Okay. So, Allison, thank you so much for your question. Okay. So, it's great that you framed your question, first of all, noticing that for the most part, like things are running smoothly. You've had a nice weight loss with the help of the semaglutide weight loss medication. And your brain has a question about what happens when the meds go away. That's the question that your automatic thinking has offered to you. And your other question, you have two questions here. The second one, how do I deal with the brain chatter I've had for 30 plus years when the meds are gone? Okay, so let's take the first question. What happens when the meds go away? What's interesting is that in your very last sentence of your email to me, is that you want to stay on a low maintenance dose when the time comes. So that's part of the answer to the question of what happens when the meds go away. Well, you'll be on a lower maintenance dose, hopefully. And how do you know? So you have direction for your brain by answering part of it. So when your brain moves to uncertainty about what happens when you're done with your weight loss and you're ready to kind of figure out what maintenance looks like, the answer to your brain is, with the help of your doctor, you will experiment with different ways to get to perhaps a lower dose, and or you might spread out the timing between your doses. You might, what used to be 7 days, injecting every 7 days, maybe you'll start with 8 and then work up to 10, something like that. And you'll see how your brain chatter, how your sense of hunger and your sense of enough kind of tracks with any of these changes that you make. You might want to do one change at a time. Like, for example, if you're at a full dose of Wegovy, which I believe is 2.4, you might want to go down to the dose that's one less than that optimal dose, and just see how you do, see if there's any changes. I mean, I have a bunch of clients and myself who are on weight loss medication. And this process, just like weight loss, is unique and different for each person. So just know that like your process will be unique, and your job is to stay right with yourself, encouraging yourself to meet some of these changes and adaptations with the full support that you gave yourself when you went on the Wegovy, when you decided you might look at the option of Wegovy, when you decided you were going to lose weight even before you were on Wegovy. So you'll tell your brain that what happens when the meds go away is that you support yourself, you work with your doctor, and you are willing to be experimental and stay right with yourself, knowing that you have lots of different options no matter what kind of result happens from it. The most recent feedback I have is from a client who's been off of it for 2 weeks. And she says, like, completely off of it. And she said that there's been basically no change. She hasn't noticed any changes. She's still able to eat the same way that she adapted to eating being on the weight loss medication, which is amazing. I think the more difficult examples of adapting to going off the medication or decreasing to a maintenance dose come from those who allow the differences in hunger and enough that weight loss medication feels like when you have it, and you kind of like, they will lean on that rather than stay aware of their hunger and enough cues and making deliberate decisions based on those cues. Right. So one is unconscious and the other one is conscious. So, okay, what does that look like? Well, some people on weight loss medication, right? They just remember always feeling hungry, never feeling like they're satisfied, always wanting to have more. So when they go on the medication, all of a sudden, they don't feel as hungry and they're feeling satisfied with portions that before they never felt satisfied with. And they just kind of let the physical do its job without thinking on purpose about what they're doing about that. So in one case, it could look like this. The unconscious way is, oh, I just totally forgot all about eating until I realized it was dinner time. And then being conscious, on the other hand, would be something like, I planned for my food that day. And when it was time for breakfast, I noticed that I wasn't hungry, so I didn't have breakfast. And then when it came time for lunch, I noticed I still wasn't hungry, although I gave myself the option to eat if I thought it would help. But I thought, no, I'm just going to see and experiment with how long it takes me to feel hungry today. And then I noticed I was finally hungry around 4, and I had my planned dinner. And I'm super proud of myself that I just experimented with, like, for today, how long does it take me to get hungry? And I'm just going to wait until that cue. You see how the first example where it's just like, I'm just going to forget all about food until I get my hunger signal, is leaning 100% on the effects of the weight loss to trigger your actions without any thinking in between them. In the second example, yes, there's changed hunger cues, right? That are less than they've been, but you're staying right with your experience. You're noticing the cue and you're making deliberate decisions all along the way. This way, you have your skin in the game because you're still paying attention to your changed physical cues. So you can see that the person who has solely been relying on the changes in physical hunger and enough cues, when you get to maintenance and you might want to back off on the medication, now you've developed a habit of solely relying on physical cues to trigger your actions without any thinking in between. And if you end up feeling a little bit more hunger, relatively slightly more hunger and slightly less enough because you're going down on your medication, then you're setting yourself up to have to do the mental work if you don't want to start eating more and more often. You see? So it sounds to me like you've been doing the work of staying conscious and being an active player with the medication. So your results are not just from the changed physical feedback that you get from your stomach, but you're also practicing deliberate decisions ahead of time. And hopefully, when you have the thought to eat when you're not hungry, you're still really questioning that. And hopefully choosing, no, we don't eat just because we have a thought to eat. That's not the criteria that we want to have determine whether or not we decide to eat. We only want to eat when there's physical hunger present. Whatever we might be wanting to look for by eating when we're not hungry, we need to figure what that root cause is. What are we thinking food is going to give us if in fact we're not hungry for the food? And that is what needs work. So I always say with weight loss medication, it makes it easier, yes, to follow your hunger and enough cues. Like that bar comes down. It's kind of like, when you do hurdles and track and field, it's like taking the hurdle and you kind of cut it down by half. It's just easier to practice. But nonetheless, you need to practice, right? You need to practice because, and I talked about this a little bit before on episode 57, anti-fragility and weight loss. If you haven't listened to that one, please go back and listen to it. If you don't do your mindset work, whether you're on weight loss medication or not, right? Then you're creating a fragile weight loss system. Because as soon as the body changes or the circumstance in your life changes, right? Then you'll be beholden to those changes. You won't know how to mediate your response based on what's going on in your life. So let's say, you've been doing your mindset work while you're on Wegovy, you get to a lower dose, right? And then let's say something really upsetting happens at work, something really emotional. Maybe your boss is just being absolutely horrible. I mean, it happens sometimes, right? And there's a lot of negative emotions that traditionally you would have eaten over. And you know that with the weight loss you've been able to create, that if you eat over how you feel at work, you're going to end up putting weight back on. So you can lean on the thought work that you've been doing the whole time and just say, okay, well, now I've got to figure out how I can't change my boss, right? But I can change how I think about my boss when I'm at work. I can create good boundaries, and I'm staying right with myself through this change in circumstance so that no matter what the brain sends up, I'm not afraid of how I feel. I'm going to translate what's going on in my desire to eat over how I feel and take care of myself by looking at the needs underneath my desire to overeat, right? So it's always about thought work. It's about doing things in an intentional way, whether you're on the medication or not. So to answer your question about the brain chatter, how do I deal with brain chatter you've had for 30 plus years when the meds are gone? Well, guess what? The meds never changed your brain chatter. You just started thinking differently, right? So here's what you're implying. You said that being like the implication on your question is that because you were on the meds, your brain chatter went down. No, you just had different beliefs when you were on the meds. The meds don't change your brain chatter. The meds only change how you experience hunger and how you experience enough. Okay. So going down on to a low maintenance dose may not change your hunger and enough that you hear that brain chatter again. It may not even happen. Okay. Maybe a non-issue, but let's say it does a little bit. Let's say on the lower dose, you have twice as many urges as you have when you're on the optimal dose. Well, you're just going to question those thoughts. Just because you have a thought to eat doesn't mean you need to eat. Just because you feel uncomfortable or stressed or that you need relief or you're overwhelmed doesn't mean food sliding down your throat helps that. And if you notice in your time on the medication, none of those negative emotions ever went away. You just weren't eating over them as much as you had probably before. So look at that and ask yourself, how was I coping with overwhelm? The same overwhelm that I tended to feel even before I was on medication, but I wasn't eating over it this time. I often give the example of like when I went as a teenager and I got this summer job away from my hometown. And when I got back, none of my clothes fit me. I'd lost a bunch of weight and I wasn't even trying to. So I asked myself, like, what had changed, right? That I wasn't eating as much. And the answer is I was just busy. I was just busy all the time. And I didn't have a kitchen that was right there like I did in my house. It was like I had to go down into the hotel and get into the kitchen and rummage around. We weren't really allowed to do that. So all of my extra snacking I was doing went away and I was much more active. I was riding my bike every day. Okay. So I asked myself the same thing when I got back and I noticed that I had lost the weight. How was I going to deal with some of the same emotions going back to my hometown that I had had before that I clearly understood and saw I was eating over? Well, I had been changed by my experience of going to get that summer job. I had proven to myself that I can change up my life. I can change up my focus and bring some new elements into my life so I don't pay so much attention to the things that were bothering me that I was probably eating and snacking over. Or maybe I was just bored. And you could do the same thing too. Knowing that you've lost the weight on the medication, let that mean you're a different person now, right? You have had success. You know what it's like to eat less and you don't die. It's actually preferable. It makes life simpler. You spend less money on food. You think about food less often. So just encourage yourself to keep the good parts of what you've created with your weight loss on Wegovy and don't give magical properties to the Wegovy. You can handle a little bit more hunger and a little bit less satiety because you have your thought work and you have the benefit of having created all this momentum with your weight loss. So I hope I built the case for you to just know that because of the changes you've had the guts to try and experiment with, and you've had some nice successes, just know that those habits of eating a little bit less are in there. All you have to do is just keep the momentum going with that. Care less about the negative what ifs and redirect your brain to wanting to eat the same way. And whatever emotions you might have on a smaller dose of Wegovy, you have the tools and the capability to handle. Okay. Thank you so much for your question, Allison. The next question comes from Kay Ann. So she says, she's having bilateral hip replacement this summer. She's very judgmental of my body shape. My lower belly is where I carry extra weight. I need to lose 30 pounds. I am 220 pounds most days. I can do strength training and core, adjusting to my ability. She says she has nice arms, not bad shaped legs, but my middle torments me. I need help on those thoughts. Okay. So notice, Kay-Ann, that how you think about your middle leaves you with a feeling of being tormented. I want you to really think about the qualities of that emotion of being tormented, because it will tell you a lot. It will give you clues about the kinds of and habits and patterns of your thinking about your middle. So someone who's tormented is constantly getting negative input on the thing that makes them feel terrible. So the clues are telling me that you have a very strong habit of giving a lot of thinking attention to the part of your body that you tend to think negative thoughts about. And it's not that the middle itself is the problem. It's the constant practice of thinking negatively about your middle that is actually the real source of the torment. So this is a habit of thinking that is the problem, much less the middle itself. So here's what I want you to do, Kayan. I want you to practice refocusing from noticing what you don't like and what you don't want about your middle and how it looks. And every time you catch yourself with that, I want you to redirect your attention to the things that you're doing that are going to help you create the physiology that you want to create, the strength, the flexibility, this strength training, the core, right? And I want you to find a way to think about your middle that creates at a minimum acceptance. Because now when I say that, what happens? Like what's your gut response to finding acceptance with how the middle of your torso looks, your middle that torments you? If you have a lot of resistance to thinking about finding acceptance, then what you're doing is you have a practice of arguing with what is. And when we argue with how things are, the reality of how things are, we lose every time. So what this does is it creates negative thought looping, which goes right back to the tormenting. Negative thought looping, if you all have ever, if this sort of resonates for you, it's the brain's arguing with what is, wanting things to be different than how they are. And because we can't change how things are, we just want to keep asking it to change. And instead, you could say, what is the downside of accepting the middle of your body and how it looks? I mean, this is a real thing that your work that you need to do. What is the downside of accepting this part of your body that torments you? And let inner self, let that part of you who's really feels strongly about how it looks, have her say. Do not edit. Do not judge. Let's just see it. But I want you to see it on paper. Okay. There could be a lot here that is logical, some that's illogical, some that's just not true, and maybe some golden threads that do feel true. If you drop the judgment of how your body looks, this part of your body, what are you afraid is going to happen? Let's just hear it. Because what I also know is that you're thinking about your middle in a way that creates torment, the feeling of torment within you. There's some part of you that thinks that this is helpful in some way. And I really want you to question that. Is it helpful? Is it helping you? Is it helping you do what you know you want to do? Or is it just arguing with what is and making life harder than it needs to be? I find that a lot of my clients, there's this negative belief that creeps in there due to various reasons, some in childhood that go way, way back, where the best way to explain the difficulty of life in various ways was to just focus on how you yourself, or maybe your body, or both, are not enough, unacceptable, not worthy. And what that does is it distracts from the hard thing out there in life, and it brings it into ourselves where we have easy access, and it gives us this sense of control. Like judging gives us this sense of like, if I judge this, then I feel right about my outlook on life. And what that does is it gives us a payoff in terms of dopamine. Like you will be feeding your brain dopamine every time you tell yourself a story that you believe is right. Because that's all the brain wants to do. It will agree and tell you anything unconsciously. As long as the human within thinks that that's right, then that's what the brain will do. The brain is 100% dedicated to whatever it is you're after. So if you believe that you can only feel better if your middle looks different, then your brain will go all in on that and give you endless examples about why your middle is unacceptable. The problem is that strategy never helps you find a way out of this. It only keeps you in the struggle of arguing with what is, right? Maybe you can. So for this, we use a technique called laddering. So take your most painful thought about your middle once you write about it. And I want you to ask yourself, if I was to move toward acceptance from this really hard feeling thought about my middle, how could I slightly change what I think about my middle to move toward acceptance? Because you're going to have to go through a bunch of stages until you can get to acceptance. So that might just look like I'm open to believing that my middle is not disgusting. I'm open to believing it. I'm willing to believe. I'm hopeful when I think I might one day have a more accepting relationship with my body. Something like that. So play with thought laddering. That's slight changes in what we think is true to move us toward a feeling that's less tormented and more accepting. That's your work, Kayanne. Okay. So play with that and see how you do. Okay. Third question is from Julie. She says she is currently, she's read my book and she's listened to all the episodes of my podcast more than once. That's amazing. Okay. She's currently at goal weight, working maintenance after a long winding tail. I had weight loss surgery in the 90s and dieted with bright line eating to learn what and how much to eat. The next road in the journey brought me to like mindset work and taking Ozempic. Together with all that, she's down 123 pounds, and I'm thrilled to be at 135 pounds. Amazing, Julie. That's amazing. She said, you asked for questions for the podcast. I'd love to hear more from someone who's traveled the weight loss drugs path. Okay, so we have another question about weight loss drugs. I'm stretching out the number of days between shots and prioritizing movement and weight bearing exercise. Anything that you can contribute would be beneficial. Well, that's amazing. I think a lot of what I answered in the first question will probably already have helped you, Julie, and how you think about things. I think the most underutilized idea about being at goal weight, having used weight loss medication, is that you are in charge of how you figure out a maintenance that is right for you, number one. And number two, that the habits that the weight loss medication allowed you to practice a little bit easier as compared to when you didn't have the medication, right? Those count for something. The repetition of how many times you waited for hunger before you ate, and the fewer times you were overeating, and the increased number of times that you were stopping at a point of fullness that was less than you used to stop at, the repetitions of all of those things have created pathways in your brain that you can continue to reinforce. And for some of us, like I mentioned before, you may not need the medication long time, like long term to do that. It may be a process. It may be like a 2-3 year process for you to slowly wean off the medication and continue to let some of those habits have repetitions and let them really sink in so that they become the new normal. And like one example of this is eating to a sense of what is enough. So I think when we all look back on when right before we start to lose weight, that sense of like how your stomach felt when you would stop eating, for many of us, it was full, right? Like it was definitely above 80% of our stomach's capacity. There was a sense of stretching. There was a sense of like heaviness, a lack of energy because of all that we had put in our stomachs. Like it required a lot of energy from our body, and we were just kind of tired and lethargic after we would eat. Maybe we would have to even wear like stretchy pants or something like that. And through the process of weight loss, on meds or off, we learn to eat a percentage of less food. And the more you do that, the more you normalize how good it feels to eat less than that amount. So what you're doing is you're developing a positive association with what eating the right amount feels like. And it's kind of like you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Once you realize how good it feels to eat 70% full rather than 90, 100, 110% full, you don't want to go back there. The only reason why that felt good was because you normalized it. That all of those feelings of feeling the overfull and all those negatives, they were always there, but you were thinking, I love to feel this way. I like to eat this much amount. I always feel better when I eat like this, right? Because many of us think overeating is the answer, and that's why we have weight to lose. So just notice like how things are different now. You've now normalized eating to a lesser percentage, and you have all of these physical cues that are aligned with this positive association. I mean, this is a terrible example, but it just kind of comes to mind. I remember when I used to be a smoker back in the early 90s, late 80s, I would smoke a certain brand of cigarettes. They were like Parliament. For some reason, one of those summers at the place that I worked at, I couldn't find them. So I had to go to a different brand. And after a month or two of smoking that different brand, when I would try to go back to the Parliament, they just didn't taste right. A lot of times this happens with different foods too. Like if you try an artificial sweetener after you've been used to using sugar in your coffee, say, for example, I mean, you can adapt to it, but usually that transition doesn't feel great in the beginning. But once you acclimate to it, that becomes the new normal. And so I want you to just not minimize what you've created here in getting all the way to goal weight. You have normalized eating relatively smaller amounts, probably less often than you used to eat when you had that weight on you. And you've got all of the positive thoughts and associations about how good that feels. So all I would say to you to take away with your amazing result that you've created that I'm sure you're feeling so proud about is to just keep that momentum going. I often talk about momentum. Your brain is going to worry and fret, and it's going to throw up some automatic thinking, like what's going to happen now, or is it going to now be hard? And I want you to just selectively ignore those thoughts and instead go to the positive momentum of every day falling in love with the way that you've learned to eat that has brought you all the way to your goal weight of 135. For more on this concept of selective ignoring, go back into the podcast episodes from last year and you'll find a lot more about selective ignoring. I would say your takeaway is lean on the skill of selective ignoring and redirect your thinking to what feels good and the normalization of the food lifestyle that you've been able to create. Okay, Julie, congratulations again on all of your success. I'm super, super proud of you. Gosh, I'd love to interview you one day if you're up for it, on all that you've been through and your persistence that got you through the long, long journey on this. So I'm smiling as I'm saying this. Okay, so that's it for our bonus Q&A. Thanks, everybody. I'm taking a new crop of questions now. I've cleaned out the questions. So if you want to ask me a question for me to address on the podcast, join my email list. You can go to hbeardsley.com/subscribe. That's HBEARDSLEY.com/subscribe and sign up for the newsletter. And you can reply to any of my automatic emails and let me know what your question is for the podcast. Okay, stay focused and so long. Hey, if this episode resonated for you, then let's connect. Visit hbeardsley.com/subscribe. That's HBEARDSLEY.com/subscribe and get on the list. You'll get a free gift, periodic coaching, plus advance notice of in-person events and workshops.